Emiliana is the Science Director of the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley and co-instructor of its popular Science of Happiness online course. This fascinating course was profiled last year in U.S. News and World Report in an article, Can You Teach Happiness? And we're grateful that she's able to be here today to teach us all a little bit more about the science of happiness.
Yes, I'm here. I'm open. And is this me being on the phone the best way for me to speak to the audience?
Yes. Yeah. Everyone can hear you now.
Terrific. Okay, well, thank you for that introduction and for your extraordinary patience and willingness to accommodate my misunderstanding of time. All right, so let's talk about what happiness means. There are a couple different ways that researchers and people themselves think about happiness. One of them we call evaluative, and this is essentially how we think about our lives and how we think about ourselves on a kind of more dispositional or personality level. So am I a kind person? Am I generally enthusiastic or cheerful? This is sort of how we think about ourselves. And the other is experiential, and this is how we feel day in and day out, and particularly the kinds of emotions that we experience that are usually short-lived, and their responses to specific experiences or contexts. And the important thing to take into mind from this slide about happiness is that both of these are an important part of what it means to be a happy person. And the mistake that many can make when they don't have the kinds of information that we've been talking about today with you is to prioritize one of them in the absence of the other. So if you imagine, well, I'm going to be happy by trying to feel pleasure and gratify my desires and be enthusiastic and cheerful all the time as a reflection of how I feel, this actually gets in the way of your capacity for being happy. And if you think your way to happiness and think, well, I'm just going to work hard all day long, every moment, and feel miserable for a variety of reasons, stressed, anxious, frustrated, but I just believe in my mind that I'm working towards happiness. That also doesn't work. Both of them together are an important part of what it means to be happy. When we talk about where happiness comes from, what the kind of origins of happiness are, there's a long tradition in this thinking space. Happiness is in some regard been thought of as a reflection of kind of what the stars offer, right? Your astrological fortune. Happy as a word actually shares its roots with the idea of luck, and you see this in words like happenstance or perhaps. Today, the extent to which luck is probably playing a role in happiness is more about kind of your genetic endowment, or perhaps even you could imagine your lived experiences where you don't have much control over how those go early in your life. Virtue is kind of the Greeks and Romans decided, well, even if you're being stretched on the torture rack, if you're living a life that is of virtue, then you're a happy person. While today's thinking really reflects more on ideas of purpose and meaning are actually quite pervasive in the healthcare context. People who work in healthcare professions tend to score quite high on measures of purpose, and that does fuel an advantage for them in the space of happiness also. A third aspect or idea that gets thought of in the science of happiness is hedonism, this idea that pleasure, right, how we get to gratify desires and accumulate resources and moments of joy is really the secret to happiness. And in fact, there is some extent to which enjoying the good moments in life plays a role. Again, it certainly isn't the most promising aspiration that will lead to happiness to try to maximize pleasure all the time. Our physiological systems relate to pleasure in a way that is shifting, and we get used to things that are good. And should we be pursuing happiness through continuous pleasure, we'll end up on what's called the hedonic treadmill, constantly striving for something bigger and better. The last big piece of happiness has to do with how we connect with the people around us and whether we feel socially supported. And it turns out that being very happy really only happens when we do feel like we are part of a meaningful social relationship, be that with a family member or a friend or a community. We need to have someone to rely on and feel like others rely on us in order to realize and experience happiness. So these are big forces that play into how people think about happiness. A recent overview of the relationship between happiness health, published by Andrew Steptoe, surveys the different factors that contribute to happiness, from genetics to socioeconomic status to stress exposure. And while all these do in different ways contribute to the magnitude of a given person's happiness, they do in different ways and with different weight according to whether we're measuring evaluative or experiential happiness. For example, socioeconomic status plays a bigger role in evaluative happiness than experiential happiness. You may be very successful, highly achieved, and earning quite a bit of money, but on a day-to-day basis, that doesn't mean that you will be feeling or experiencing those genuine positive emotions like love and affection and enthusiasm and pride, etc. So this is just an overview, very recent, of all the factors that contribute to happiness. When we think about variance in happiness, so why is my happiness score different than yours? Sonia Lubomirsky has offered this model, which basically suggests that our genetic endowment seems to explain about half of the difference between my happiness score and the person next to me. Life circumstances, while many think have a lot to do with why my happiness might be different than yours. You know, I was an only child, or I was the one of 7 children and never got any attention, or I didn't have music lessons, or whatever lived experiences we might, complain to our parents about when we try to think about the reasons for our happiness. Those actually end up not being a big explanation or offering a lot of explanatory power to why we're happier or less happier than the person next to us. And this leaves this big chunk of happiness difference between two people being about what they're doing with their time day in and day out. And that's really what we focus on at the Greater Good Science Center. What are the things that people can do day in and day out to really bolster this overarching quality of life that we call happiness, right? The experience of joy or contentment or positive well-being combined with a sense that our life is meaningful. And there you see those experiential and evaluative aspects of happiness represented. And Ed Diener, one of the other pioneers in happiness science, really uses a different term, but we consider it equivalent. He calls it subjective well-being. This is, again, the capacity to experience positive emotions pretty easily, the ability to kind of get through the difficult times, which will result in negative emotions, which are important and matter to happiness, but we don't want them to be overrepresented, super frequent, or last too long. And then again, this cognitive evaluation that life is good. To measure happiness, researchers administer surveys, and here are 3 examples of different survey items that you might see if you were in a study of happiness. And then on the other side of the slide is an app made by my friend and colleague Matt Killingsworth to try to understand in a what we call experience sampling fashion. How are you feeling? What are you doing right now? Are you thinking about what you're doing? And the effort here is to try to understand how daily experiences and activities really relate to those momentary experiences of enjoyment. And what Matt's research study showed was that when people are paying attention to what they're doing, so they're doing maybe their house cleaning, maybe they're playing with their children at the park, or maybe they're working at their computer, whatever it is that they're doing, if they are paying attention to what they're doing and not thinking about other things, right, not distracted by something earlier in the day that made them feel unpleasant or something later in the day on their docket that they're not looking forward to, they experience any moment as being more pleasurable. And this is one of the things that is a great focus of the happiness literature, sort of awareness of the present moment. And this does fall into the umbrella of what many call mindfulness or contemplative practice, the quality of being able to be in a moment and notice exactly what's happening in that moment in your own self and in the context around you without kind of biasing it with or contributing to the experience with sort of future ideas or past worries. In our own data set, which we, sorry, I'm going to the next slide, just to reflect on a couple other key findings from the research on happiness that use these methods, the survey methods, to understand the relationship between life experiences and happiness. Ed Diener and Marty Seligman published long ago, they're finding that regardless of what's going on in a person's life, they never fall into the very happy bucket unless they have strong social relationships. They have to have someone to rely on. And the health literature sort of echoes this sentiment in its survey of the literature on loneliness, which basically shows that when people are socially isolated or lonely, they are vulnerable to whole host of physical disease and ailment and psychological states of disease also. And there's these great sort of snippets of insight that compare loneliness to some of the common risk factors or health behaviors that people already understand are really harmful to health and well-being. And it turns out again that, you know, being lonely is equivalent in that regard. In our own data from our Science of Happiness course, we ask people to fill out surveys about how they're doing in terms of their own happiness. We also use a scale to measure well-being. We ask them to rate how similar they feel to others, how stressed they are, how lonely they are. We also ask them to nominate a peer, which is another friend, to remark on that student. And the friends also explain what the nature of their relationship from poor to exceptional. And in the data charts that we're looking at, we don't actually get very many people who nominate a person who then rates the quality of their relationship as poor. So I'm only showing you good, very good, excellent, and exceptional. And the point of this slide is that across two different samples of cumulatively over 3,000 people all around the world, the higher the quality of the relationship as rated by the peer, this is someone not in the course, the higher the well-being score by the student themselves, their own self-reported well-being score. And the point being that social relationships, again, in this sample of our own data, confer an advantage on the student in terms of their happiness, well-being, and lower levels of stress and loneliness. And all of these differences between groups of students are statistically significant. In a second example from our data, we also asked peers to indicate how various emotional qualities to the students. So again, peers are individuals who are not enrolled in our course, but who know the students enrolled in the course. And so we ask peers, like, think back on the last time you interacted with this student. Were they enthusiastic, cheerful, happy? Were they kind, generous, grateful, compassionate? And were they irritated, frustrated, annoyed? And what I've done is taken you through kind of positive qualities, pro-social qualities, and antisocial qualities. And what you see in this chart is that the relationships that are rated as exceptional by the peers are the same relationships with students who score high on pro-social qualities. So it's not so much that we like other people who are cheerful and enthusiastic and sort of amusing and fun. We really like other people who are kind. And we form the most meaningful, close relationships that actually turn around and benefit us the most by being pro-social. And that's, again, the gist of what the Greater Good Science Center is offering. And the reason I have two charts here is just because we're drawing from two different samples over 2 different years, and it suggests, again, the strength and validity of the data. Other ways that we measure happiness is by looking at expressive behavior and looking at activation of pathways in the brain that represent or signal feelings of enjoyment or pleasure or connection or affiliation. Typically, it's dopamine circuits, but often it can be circuits that speak in the language of oxytocin or serotonin, or even the endorphin system, which tends to quiet our own distress in the service of being able to help another person. A recent study, just to hone down into some of the health benefits of happiness, in this study from 2010, researchers interviewed individuals in Canada, in the Canadian healthcare system, and engaged their happiness by measuring kind of their expressions, their tone of voice, the kinds of things they talked about in this interview, and then related that that index to their vulnerability or the incidence of coronary heart disease. And in this study, what they showed is that just 1 degree increase in happiness and rating of happiness makes people 22% less likely to experience coronary heart disease. So there are these really clear, measurable ways that happiness affords health. In a second study related in a related domain, happiness is associated with immune response. So in this case, we had the researchers evaluated the mood of a person on the day of a vaccination. So that would be baseline, and then, or actually on the day of vaccination, and gathered indices of immune response, and basically showed that at 4 weeks and 16 weeks post-vaccine, the individuals who were in a better mood, who were happier on the day of the vaccine, generated a healthier immune response to that vaccine. In another similar study, researchers actually exposed participants to a cold virus, and those participants who scored higher on measures of happiness were less likely to actually develop a cold, again suggesting that happiness affords a greater, a more effective immune response. Looking at, again, people's facial expressions, and this time young children, Laura Ackman and Elizabeth Dunn have shown that when kids are given the chance to share with a puppet, and all of these different conditions along the bottom are different variants of sharing. There's one that's highlighted in yellow, which is when the kid is sharing from their own little cup of goldfish crackers. In the other conditions, they're kind of fined a goldfish or they're given a goldfish to share. And the point is that when kids, young kids, these are 2-year-olds, are giving from their own supply, they smile most broadly and most authentically and most genuinely compared to other circumstances that you might imagine would bring people joy. And this, again, is to highlight the importance of generosity and the essence, the essential fundamental drive to be generous in bringing happiness. In this research study, a neuroscientist collaborated with neuroeconomists to understand this idea, because of course economists like to think that humans are totally rational and objective and will maximize gain to themselves because that is mathematically sensible. In fact, that's not what happens in the brain. When this team, including researcher Bill Harbaugh and his colleague Dr. Hubbard, looked at charitable behaviors over the course of multiple studies, what they find is that being charitable, contributing to the welfare of others, actually ends up activating neural circuits that are associated with reward and pleasure and reinforcement, which again means that we're driven, we're fundamentally motivated to give to others. And Jamil Zaki at Stanford, I love this quote, says that being kind to others registers in the brain is more like eating chocolate than like fulfilling an obligation to do what's right. And again, the chocolate is it's a source of pleasure. So can being kind to others be high on the list also. Laura Ackman and Elizabeth Dunn, again, looking around the world and connecting pro-social spending or charitable giving, the generousness of people in a particular geographic location, looking at how that relates to happiness, measures of happiness. And it turns out that with the exception of places that they didn't study, which are in gray, or places where there is terrific strife or threat or warfare or inadequate resources, which are in pink and red, everywhere else that they look, the relationship between generosity and happiness is a positive one. And so again, humans have this fundamental drive to be generous. Why else is it helpful to be happy? Well, we live longer. We also have more satisfying relationships. And I'm going quickly through that live longer because I know that we're short on time. But there's many studies looking at happiness and in people over a period of 5 to 10 to 15 years, showing that people who score higher on happiness are just less likely to die over the course of those longitudinal projects. When we're happier, other people rate us as more likable, and that's what you're looking at in this rather dated study, but sort of foundational. If we see somebody who's smiling, we find them more likable. Their smile actually arouses a positive feeling in ourselves. We enjoy that. So being a happy person is an advantage to us socially. We're more effective in our work, and supervisors rate our work as more innovative and creative when we are a happy person, when we score high on happy measures of happiness. Recently, we just got a new iteration of the World Happiness Report, which has been coming out every year since 2012. And basically what this team of researchers, both economists and well-being researchers, has been showing time and time again is that happiness is as worthwhile to study as a metric of national success as the traditional measures that we might think of, like GDP and literacy or mortality or health and well-being or effective social systems, because all those things are improved when happiness goes up. There is quite a long list of findings that offer specific strategies or techniques or practices that can be conducive of happiness. I've organized these here into two columns. One that is about contentment, and that is kind of your ability to be present in the moment that you're in. You can achieve this through the more kind of quote-unquote spiritual mindfulness kind of practices. Secular mindfulness practices are out there too, or even just breathing practices. And yoga traditions can be quite helpful in helping cultivate awareness of the moment that we're in and awareness of our mental habits that might actually not serve happiness. Being optimistic is a really helpful kind of habit of thought that contributes to happiness. Self-compassion is a rich and fascinating literature that points to the kind of opposite of self-criticism. And what we found is that when people are self-critical, they're just less likely to meet their objectives and reach their goals, despite popular opinion. Experiences that offer levity, amusement, or awe in the face of, nature or beauty can be really powerful ways to ratchet up happiness. And then, of course, anything we can do to establish and strengthen resilience is of value to happiness, and particularly for healthcare providers who face more emotional labor than most in terms of their professional activities. And the second column is the strength and social connection objective. What can individuals do to build this, what we call trust, or Amy Edmondson calls psychological safety? Can we engage in activities or design our spaces to instill a sense of common humanity? Can we get better at just having small informal conversations with each other that help us get to know each other and understand where each other are coming from? There's an incredibly delightful space of science that explores gratitude and the extent to which gratefulness confers happiness, both individually and within relationships and communities. There's many ideas that help us build social support, from becoming more empathically attuned to exercising compassion, being willing to ask for help, and sort of honing our skills at reconciling conflict. A lot of Westerners in particular think that they are better off holding grudges than apologizing and forgiving, when in fact that's simply a myth. There's a ton of research, which we've touched upon already, about how generosity through kindness towards others is actually something that serves happiness. As an example of the fact that this can happen and that practices can work, I'm showing you some data again from our course. One of the practices that we encourage people to try in our course is called active listening, and it's a way of empathically tuning in to what another person is saying without imagining what you're going to respond with or what else might be on your list of objectives for the day or the evening, but really just attuning to them completely. And what I'm showing you is that the rates at which people report having done them, and then also their perceptions of perceived change. And in terms of feelings of connection and empathy and overall happiness, the more people do this practice, the higher their ratings of change are. And that's your blue and purple chart on one side. And the other side, we ask, how does this practice affect other aspects of well-being, like your close relationships, the quality of your social interactions, your satisfaction at work or school, the effectiveness with which you feel like you can help others, and just your physical experience as a person. Are you in pain more often or less often? And again, the more people report doing this practice, the stronger impact they report this practice having on them. So again, at the Greater Good Science Center, we have a library of different practices pulled out of research studies that have shown that these kinds of activities can really build happiness. And so we offer this to anyone and everyone. We also teach a series of courses on the science of happiness at work, which draw from these practices. And just to kind of lighten the mood a little bit, these are some of my favorite little cartoons that I think relate to the experience of happiness or potential for happiness at work. The bottom right one about empathy is one of my favorites. I don't understand how that provider's pants really work, but in any case, empathy doesn't mean totally absorbing or taking on another person's emotion. At least the healthy kind of empathy that leads to compassion doesn't mean that. What we mean is sort of engaging that caregiving, nurturing spirit in the face of another person's suffering. So in closing, I just want to share a quote from Dan Gilbert, one of the foremost experts on happiness, and in particular the mistakes that we make in thinking about what will or won't make us happy. He says, if I wanted to predict your happiness and I could know one thing about you, it wouldn't be your gender, religion, health, or income. I'd want to know about your social network, about your friends, your family, the strength of the bonds with them. And that's really, again, what the Greater Good Science Center is here to offer people specific strategies for, is building those relationships, engaging your generous impulse, your innate kind of drive to be kind and cooperative and draw on others for support as a resource, and the extent to which these activities really build happiness. So I'll end with just a list of the resources that we offer out in the world for anyone and everyone to access if they want to know more and learn more. One thing that's not on this list that I really like is our Science of Happiness podcast. I was lucky enough to be a guest host yesterday with an award-winning poet, Ross Gay, who wrote a book called The Book of Delights, where he wrote for 1 year an essay every day about what was delightful. He's sort of a prodigy of happiness practice. So if you like to listen to a podcast while you exercise, they're wonderful little 20-minute episodes that describe different people's experiences with various happiness practices and experts who have studied those practices in their own research. Thank you again for your patience, your willingness to accommodate things not working out as expected, and I am happy to answer any questions.